Chapter 56. Left Flank Movement Across the Chickahominy and James General Lee Visit to Butler. The Movement on Petersburg. The Investment of Petersburg. Lee's position was now so near Richmond and the intervening swamps of the Chickahominy so great an obstacle to the movement of troops in the face of an enemy that I determined to make my next left flank move carry the Army of the Potomac south of the James River. Preparations for this were promptly commenced. The move was a hazardous one to make. The Chickahominy River, with its marshy and heavily timbered approaches, had to be crossed. All the bridges over it east of Lee were destroyed. The enemy had a shorter line and better roads to travel on to confront me in crossing. More than 50 miles intervened between me and Butler, by the roads I should have to travel, with both the James and the Chickahominy unbridged to cross. And last, the Army of the Potomac had to be got out of a position but a few hundred yards from the enemy at the widest place. Lee, if he did not choose to follow me, might, with his shorter distance to travel and his bridges over the Chickahominy and the James, move rapidly on Butler and crush him before the army with me could come to his relief. Then, too, he might spare troops enough to send against Hunter, who was approaching Lynchburg, living upon the country he passed through, and without ammunition further than what he carried with him. But the move had to be made, and I relied upon Lee's not seeing my danger as I saw it. Besides, we had armies on both sides of the James River and not far from the Confederate capital. I knew that its safety would be a matter of the first consideration with the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the so-called Confederate government, if it was not with the military commanders. But I took all the precaution I knew of to guard against all dangers. Sheridan was sent with 2 divisions to communicate with Hunter and to break up the Virginia Central Railroad and the James River Canal on the 7th of June, taking instructions to Hunter to come back with him. Hunter was also informed by way of Washington and the Valley that Sheridan was on the way to meet him. The Canal and Central Road and the regions penetrated by them were of vast importance to the enemy, furnishing and carrying a large % of all the supplies for the Army of Northern Virginia and the people of Richmond. Before Sheridan got off on the 7th, news was received from Hunter reporting his advance to Staunton and successful engagement with the enemy near that place on the 5th, in which the Confederate commander, W.S. Jones, was killed. On the 4th of June, the enemy having withdrawn his left corps, Burnside on our right was moved up between Warren and Smith. On the 5th, Birney returned to Hancock, which extended his left now to the Chickahominy, and Warren was withdrawn to Cold Harbor. Wright was directed to send 2 divisions to the left to extend down the banks of that stream to Bottom's Bridge. The cavalry extended still farther east to Jones's Bridge. On the 7th, Abercrombie, who was in command at White House, and who had been in command at our base of supplies in all the changes made from the start, was ordered to take up the iron from the York River Railroad and put it on boats, and to be in readiness to move by water to City Point. On the 8th, Meade was directed to fortify a line down the bank overlooking the Chickahominy, under cover of which the army could move. On the 9th, Abercrombie was directed to send all organized troops arriving at White House without debarking from their transports to report to Butler. Halleck was at this time instructed to send all reinforcements to City Point. On the 11th I wrote, Cold Harbor, VA, June 11th, 1864. Major General B. F. Butler, Commanding Department of VA and N. C. The movement to transfer this army to the south side of the James River will commence after dark tomorrow night. Colonel Comstock, of my staff, was sent specially to ascertain what was necessary to make your position secure in the interval during which the enemy might use most of his force against you, and also to ascertain what point on the river we should reach to effect a crossing if it should not be practicable to reach this side of the river at Bermuda Hundred. Colonel Comstock has not yet returned, so that I cannot make instructions as definite as I would wish, but the time between this and Sunday night being so short in which to get word to you, I must do the best I can. Colonel Dent goes to make arrangements for gunboats and transportation to send up the Chickahominy to take to you the 18th Corps. The Corps will leave its position in the trenches as early in the evening tomorrow as possible and make a forced march to Cole's Landing or Ferry, where it should reach by 10 a.m. the following morning. This corps numbers now 300 men. They take with them neither wagons nor artillery, these latter marching with the balance of the army to the James River. The remainder of the army will cross the Chickahominy at Longbridge and at Jones's, and strike the river at the most practicable crossing below City Point. I directed several days ago that all reinforcements for the army should be sent to you. I am not advised of the number that may have gone, but suppose you have received from 6 to 10,000. General Smith will also reach you as soon as the enemy could, going by the way of Richmond. The balance of the force will not be more than 1 day behind, unless detained by the whole of Lee's army, in which case you will be strong enough. I wish you would direct the proper staff officers, your chief engineer and your chief quartermaster, to commence at once the collection of all the means in their reach for crossing the army on its arrival. If there is a point below City Point where a pontoon bridge can be thrown, have it laid. Expecting the arrival of the 18th Corps by Monday night, if you deem it practicable from the force you have to seize and hold Petersburg, you may prepare to start, on the arrival of troops, to hold your present lines. I do not want Petersburg visited, however, unless it is held, nor an attempt to take it, unless you feel a reasonable degree of confidence of success. If you should go there, I think troops should take nothing with them except what they can carry, depending upon supplies being sent after the place is secured. If Colonel Dent should not succeed in securing the requisite amount of transportation for the 18th Corps before reaching you, please have the balance supplied. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General, P.S. On reflection, I will send the 18th Corps by way of White House. The distance which they will have to march will be enough shorter to enable them to reach you about the same time, and the uncertainty of navigation on the Chickahominy will be avoided. U.S. Grant, Cold Harbor, VA, June 2nd, 1864. Major General G.G. Meade, commanding Army of the Potomac. Colonel Comstock, who visited the James River for the purpose of ascertaining the best point below Bermuda 100, to which to march the army has not yet returned. It is now getting so late, however, that all preparations may be made for the move tomorrow night without waiting longer. The movement will be made as heretofore agreed upon, that is, the 18th Corps make a rapid march with the infantry alone, their wagons and artillery accompanying the balance of the army to Cole's Landing or Ferry, and their embark for City Point, losing no time for rest until they reach the latter point. The 5th Corps will seize Longbridge and move out on the Longbridge Road to its junction with Quaker Road, or until stopped by the enemy. The other 3 corps will follow in such order as you may direct, one of them crossing at Longbridge and 2 at Jones's Bridge. After the crossing is effected, the most practicable roads will be taken to reach about Fort Powhatan. Of course, this is supposing the enemy makes no opposition to our advance. The 5th Corps, after securing the passage of the balance of the army, will join or follow in the rear of the corps, which crosses the same bridge with themselves. The wagon trains should be kept well east of the troops, and if a crossing can be found or made lower down than Jones's, they should take it. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General, P.S. In view of the long march to reach Cole's Landing and the uncertainty of being able to embark a large number of men there, the direction of the 18th Corps may be changed to White House. They should be directed to load up transports and start them as fast as loaded without waiting for the whole corps or even whole divisions to go together. U.S. Grant. About this time word was received, through the Richmond papers of the 11th, that Crook and Averill had united and were moving east. This, with the news of Hunter's successful engagement near Staunton, was no doubt known to Lee before it was to me. Then Sheridan leaving with 2 divisions of cavalry looked indeed threatening, both to Lee's communications and supplies. Much of his cavalry was sent after Sheridan, and Early with Ewell's entire corps was sent to the valley. Supplies were growing scarce in Richmond, and the sources from which to draw them were in our hands. People from outside began to pour into Richmond to help eat up the little on hand. Consternation reigned there. On the 12th, Smith was ordered to move at night to White House, not to stop until he reached there, and to take boats at once for City Point, leaving his trains and artillery to move by land. Soon after dark, some of the cavalry at Long Bridge effected a crossing by wading and floundering through the water and mud, leaving their horses behind, and drove away the cavalry pickets. A pontoon bridge was speedily thrown across, over which the remainder of the army soon passed and pushed out for a mile or two to watch and detain any advance that might be made from the other side. Warren followed the cavalry, and by the morning of the 13th had his whole corps over. Hancock followed Warren. Burnside took the road to Jones's Bridge, followed by Wright. Ferrero's division, with the wagon train, moved farther east, by Window Shades and Cole's Ferry, our rear being covered by cavalry. It was known that the enemy had some gunboats at Richmond. These might run down at night and inflict great damage upon us before they could be sunk or captured by our navy. General Butler had, in advance, loaded some vessels with stone ready to be sunk so as to obstruct the channel in an emergency. On the 13th, I sent orders to have these sunk as high up the river as we could guard them, and prevent their removal by the enemy. As soon as Warren's corps was over the Chickahominy, it marched out and joined the cavalry in holding the roads from Richmond while the army passed. No attempt was made by the enemy to impede our march, however, but Warren and Wilson reported the enemy strongly fortified in their front. By the evening of the 13th, Hancock's corps was at Charles City Courthouse on the James River. Burnside's and Wright's corps were on the Chickahominy and crossed during the night, Warren's corps and the cavalry still covering the army. The material for a pontoon bridge was already at hand, and the work of laying it was commenced immediately, under the superintendence of Brigadier General Benham, commanding the Engineer Brigade. On the evening of the 14th, the crossing commenced, Hancock in advance, using both the bridge and boats. When the Wilderness Campaign commenced, the Army of the Potomac, including Burnside's corps, which was a separate command until the 24th of May when it was incorporated with the main army, numbered about 116,000 men. During the progress of the campaign, about 40,000 reinforcements were received. At the crossing of the James River, June 14th-15th, the army numbered about 115,000. Besides the ordinary losses incident to a campaign of 6 weeks' nearly constant fighting or skirmishing, about one half of the artillery was sent back to Washington, and many men were discharged by reason of the expiration of their term of service. In estimating our strength, every enlisted man and every commissioned officer present is included, no matter how employed. In bands, sick in field hospitals, hospital attendants, company cooks, and all. Operating in an enemy's country, and being supplied always from a distant base, large detachments had at all times to be sent from the front, not only to guard the base of supplies and the roads to it, but all the roads leading to our flanks and rear. We were also operating in a country unknown to us, and without competent guides or maps showing the roads accurately. The manner of estimating numbers in the two armies differs materially. In the Confederate Army, often only bayonets are taken into account. Never, I believe, do they estimate more than are handling the guns of the artillery and armed with muskets or carbines. Generally, the latter are far enough away to be excluded from the count in any one field. Officers and details of enlisted men are not included. In the northern armies, the estimate is most liberal, taking in all connected with the army and drawing pay. Estimated in the same manner as ours, Lee had not less than 80,000 men at the start. His reinforcements were about equal to ours during the campaign, deducting the discharged men and those sent back. He was on the defensive, and in a country in which every stream, every road, every obstacle to the movement of troops and every natural defence was familiar to him and his army. The citizens were all friendly to him and his cause, and could and did furnish him with accurate reports of our every move. Rear guards were not necessary for him, and having always a railroad at his back, large wagon trains were not required. All circumstances considered, we did not have any advantage in numbers. General Lee, who had led the Army of Northern Virginia in all these contests, was a very highly estimated man in the Confederate Army and States, and filled also a very high place in the estimation of the people and press of the Northern States. His praise was sounded throughout the entire North after every action he was engaged in. The number of his forces was always lowered, and that of the national forces exaggerated. He was a large, austere man, and I judged difficult of approach to his subordinates. To be extolled by the entire press of the South after every engagement, and by a portion of the press North with equal vehemence, was calculated to give him the entire confidence of his troops and to make him feared by his antagonists. It was not an uncommon thing for my staff officers to hear from Eastern officers, "Well, Grant has never met Bobby Lee yet." There were good and true officers who believe now that the Army of Northern Virginia was superior to the Army of the Potomac man to man. I do not believe so, except as the advantages spoken of above made them so. Before the end, I believe the difference was the other way. The Army of Northern Virginia became despondent and saw the end. It did not please them. The National Army saw the same thing and were encouraged by it. The advance of the Army of the Potomac reached the James on the 14th of June. Preparations were at once commenced for laying the pontoon bridges and crossing the river. As already stated, I had previously ordered General Butler to have 2 vessels loaded with stone and carried up the river to a point above that occupied by our gunboats, where the channel was narrow, and sunk there so as to obstruct the passage and prevent Confederate gunboats from coming down the river. Butler had had these boats filled and put in position, but had not had them sunk before my arrival. I ordered this done, and also directed that he should turn over all material and boats, not then in use in the river, to be used in ferrying the troops across. I then, on the 14th, took a steamer and ran up to Bermuda Hundred to see General Butler for the purpose of directing a movement against Petersburg, while our troops of the Army of the Potomac were crossing. I had sent General W. F. Smith back from Cold Harbor by the way of White House, thence on steamers to City Point for the purpose of giving General Butler more troops with which to accomplish this result. General Butler was ordered to send Smith with his troops reinforced, as far as that could be conveniently done, from other parts of the Army of the James. He gave Smith about 6,000 reinforcements, including some 2,500 cavalry under Kautz, and about 35 coloured infantry under Hinks. The distance which Smith had to move to reach the enemy's lines was about 6 miles, and the Confederate advance line of works was but 2 miles outside of Petersburg. Smith was to move under cover of night, up close to the enemy's works, and assault as soon as he could after daylight. I believed then, and still believe, that Petersburg could have been easily captured at that time. It only had about 2,500 men in the defences, besides some irregular troops, consisting of citizens and employees in the city who took up arms in case of emergency. Smith started as proposed, but his advance encountered a rebel force entrenched between City Point and their lines outside of Petersburg. This position he carried with some loss to the enemy, but there was so much delay that it was daylight before his troops really got off from there. While there, I informed General Butler that Hancock's corps would cross the river and move to Petersburg to support Smith in case the latter was successful, and that I could reinforce there more rapidly than Lee could reinforce from his position. I returned down the river to where the troops of the Army of the Potomac now were, communicated to General Meade in writing the directions I had given to General Butler, and directed him, Meade, to cross Hancock's corps over under cover of night, and push them forward in the morning to Petersburg, halting them, however, at a designated point until they could hear from Smith. I also informed General Meade that I had ordered rations from Bermuda Hundred for Hancock's corps and desired him to issue them speedily and to lose no more time than was absolutely necessary. The rations did not reach him, however, and Hancock, while he got all his corps over during the night, remained until 10:30 in the hope of receiving them. He then moved without them, and on the road received a note from General W. F. Smith, asking him to come on. This seems to be the first information that General Hancock had received of the fact that he was to go to Petersburg, or that anything particular was expected of him. Otherwise, he would have been there by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Smith arrived in front of the enemy's lines early in the forenoon of the 15th, and spent the day until after 7 o'clock in the evening in reconnoitring what appeared to be empty works. The enemy's line consisted of redans occupying commanding positions, with rifle pits connecting them. To the east side of Petersburg, from the Appomattox back, there were 13 of these redans, extending a distance of several miles, probably 3. If they had been properly manned, they could have held out against any force that could have attacked them, at least until reinforcements could have got up from the north of Richmond. Smith assaulted with the coloured troops, and with success. By 9 o'clock at night, he was in possession of 5 of these redans, and of course of the connecting lines of rifle pits. All of them contained artillery, which fell into our hands. Hancock came up and proposed to take any part assigned to him, and Smith asked him to relieve his men who were in the trenches. Next morning, the 16th, Hancock himself was in command, and captured another redan. Meade came up in the afternoon and succeeded Hancock, who had to be relieved, temporarily, from the command of his corps on account of the breaking out afresh of the wound he had received at Gettysburg. During the day, Meade assaulted and carried 1 more redan to his right and 2 to his left. In all this we lost very heavily. The works were not strongly manned, but they all had guns in them which fell into our hands, together with the men who were handling them in the effort to repel these assaults. Up to this time, Beauregard, who had commanded south of Richmond, had received no reinforcements except Hoke's division from Drury's Bluff, which had arrived on the morning of the 16th, though he had urged the authorities very strongly to send them, believing, as he did, that Petersburg would be a valuable prize which we might seek. During the 17th, the fighting was very severe and the losses heavy, and at night our troops occupied about the same position they had occupied in the morning, except that they held a redan which had been captured by Potter during the day. During the night, however, Beauregard fell back to the line which had been already selected and commenced fortifying it. Our troops advanced on the 18th to the line which he had abandoned, and found that the Confederate loss had been very severe, many of the enemy's dead still remaining in the ditches and in front of them. Colonel J. L. Chamberlain of the 20th Maine was wounded on the 18th. He was gallantly leading his brigade at the time, as he had been in the habit of doing in all the engagements in which he had previously been engaged. He had several times been recommended for a brigadier generalcy for gallant and meritorious conduct. On this occasion, however, I promoted him on the spot and forwarded a copy of my order to the War Department, asking that my act might be confirmed and Chamberlain's name sent to the Senate for confirmation without any delay. This was done, and at last a gallant and meritorious officer received partial justice at the hands of his government, which he had served so faithfully and so well. If General Hancock's orders of the 15th had been communicated to him, that officer, with his usual promptness, would undoubtedly have been upon the ground around Petersburg as early as 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 15th. The days were long, and it would have given him considerable time before night. I do not think there is any doubt that Petersburg itself could have been carried without much loss, or at least, if protected by inner detached works, that a line could have been established very much in rear of the one then occupied by the enemy. This would have given us control of both the Weldon and South Side railroads. This would also have saved an immense amount of hard fighting which had to be done from the 15th to the 18th, and would have given us greatly the advantage in the long siege which ensued. I now ordered the troops to be put under cover and allowed some of the rest which they had so long needed. They remained quiet, except that there was more or less firing every day, until the 22nd, when General Meade ordered an advance towards the Weldon Railroad. We were very anxious to get to that road, and even round to the South Side Railroad if possible. Meade moved Hancock's corps, now commanded by Birney, to the left, with a view to at least force the enemy to stay within the limits of his own line. General Wright, with the 6th Corps, was ordered by a road farther south to march directly for the Weldon Road. The enemy passed in between these two corps and attacked vigorously, and with very serious results to the national troops, who were then withdrawn from their advanced position. The Army of the Potomac was given the investment of Petersburg, while the Army of the James held Bermuda Hundred and all the ground we possessed north of the James River. The 9th Corps, Burnside's, was placed upon the right at Petersburg, the 5th, Warren's, next, the 2nd, Birney's, next, then the 6th, Wright's, broken off to the left and south. Thus began the siege of Petersburg. Chapter 57. Raid on the Virginia Central Railroad, raid on the Weldon Railroad, Early's movement upon Washington, mining the works before Petersburg, explosion of the mine before Petersburg, campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, capture of the Weldon Railroad. On the 7th of June, while at Cold Harbor, I had, as already indicated, sent Sheridan with 2 divisions of cavalry to destroy as much as he could of the Virginia Central Railroad. General Hunter had been operating up the Shenandoah Valley with some success, having fought a battle near Staunton where he captured a great many prisoners, besides killing and wounding a good many men. After the battle, he formed a junction at Staunton with Averill and Crook, who had come up from the Kanawha or Gauley River. It was supposed, therefore, that General Hunter would be about Charlottesville, Virginia, by the time Sheridan could get there, doing on the way the damage that he was sent to do. I gave Sheridan instructions to have Hunter, in case he should meet him about Charlottesville, join and return with him to the Army of the Potomac. Lee, hearing of Hunter's success in the valley, started Breckinridge out for its defence at once. Learning later of Sheridan's going with 2 divisions, he also sent Hampton with 2 divisions of cavalry, his own and Fitzhugh Lee's. Sheridan moved to the north side of the North Anna to get out west and learned of the movement of these troops to the south side of the same stream almost as soon as they had started. He pushed on to get to Trevilian Station to commence his destruction at that point. On the night of the 10th, he bivouacked some 6 or 7 miles east of Trevilian, while Fitzhugh Lee was the same night at Trevilian Station and Hampton, but a few miles away. During the night, Hampton ordered an advance on Sheridan, hoping, no doubt, to surprise and very badly cripple him. Sheridan, however, by a counter-move, sent Custer on a rapid march to get between the 2 divisions of the enemy and into their rear. This he did successfully, so that at daylight, when the assault was made, the enemy found himself at the same time resisted in front and attacked in rear, and broke in some confusion. The losses were probably very light on both sides in killed and wounded, but Sheridan got away with some 500 prisoners and sent them to City Point. During that day, the 11th, Sheridan moved into Trevilian Station, and the following day proceeded to tear up the road east and west. There was considerable fighting during the whole of the day, but the work of destruction went on. In the meantime, at night, the enemy had taken possession of the crossing which Sheridan had proposed to take to go north when he left Trevilian. Sheridan learned, however, from some of the prisoners he had captured here, that General Hunter was about Lynchburg, and therefore that there was no use of his going on to Charlottesville with a view to meet him. Sheridan started back during the night of the 12th and made his way north and farther east, coming around by the north side of White House and arriving there on the 21st. Here he found an abundance of forage for his animals, food for his men, and security while resting. He had been obliged to leave about 90 of his own men in the field hospital which he had established near Trevilian, and these necessarily fell into the hands of the enemy. White House, up to this time, had been a depot, but now that our troops were all on the James River, it was no longer wanted as a store of supplies. Sheridan was, therefore, directed to break it up, which he did on the 22nd of June, bringing the garrison and an immense wagon train with him. All these were over the James River by the 26th of the month, and Sheridan ready to follow. In the meantime, Meade had sent Wilson's division on a raid to destroy the Weldon and South Side roads. Now that Sheridan was safe and Hampton free to return to Richmond with his cavalry, Wilson's position became precarious. Meade, therefore, on the 27th, ordered Sheridan over the river to make a demonstration in favour of Wilson. Wilson got back, though not without severe loss, having struck both roads, but the damage done was soon repaired. After these events, comparative quiet reigned about Petersburg until late in July. The time, however, was spent in strengthening the entrenchments and making our position generally more secure against a sudden attack. In the meantime, I had to look after other portions of my command, where things had not been going on so favourably, always as I could have wished. General Hunter, who had been appointed to succeed Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley, immediately took up the offensive. He met the enemy on the 5th of June at Piedmont and defeated him. On the 8th, he formed a junction with Crook and Averill at Staunton, from which place he moved directly on Lynchburg, via Lexington, which he reached and invested on the 16th. Up to this time, he was very successful, and but for the difficulty of taking with him sufficient ordnance stores over so long a march through a hostile country, he would, no doubt, have captured Lynchburg. The destruction of the enemy's supplies and manufactories had been very great. To meet this movement under General Hunter, General Lee sent Early with his corps, a part of which reached Lynchburg before Hunter. After some skirmishing on the 17th and 18th, General Hunter, owing to a want of ammunition to give battle, retired from before the place. Unfortunately, this want of ammunition left him no choice of route for his return, but by the way of the Gauley and Kanawha rivers, thence up the Ohio River, returning to Harper's Ferry by way of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. A long time was consumed in making this movement. In the meantime, the valley was left open to Early's troops and others in that quarter, and Washington also was uncovered. Early took advantage of this condition of affairs and moved on Washington. In the absence of Hunter, General Lew Wallace, with headquarters at Baltimore, commanded the department in which the Shenandoah lay. His surplus of troops with which to move against the enemy was small in number. Most of these were raw, and consequently very much inferior to our veterans and to the veterans which Early had with him. But the situation of Washington was precarious, and Wallace moved with commendable promptitude to meet the enemy at the Monocacy. He could hardly have expected to defeat him badly, but he hoped to cripple and delay him until Washington could be put into a state of preparation for his reception. I had previously ordered General Meade to send a division to Baltimore for the purpose of adding to the defences of Washington, and he had sent Ricketts's division of the 6th Corps, Wright's, which arrived in Baltimore on the 8th of July. Finding that Wallace had gone to the front with his command, Ricketts immediately took the cars and followed him to the Monocacy with his entire division. They met the enemy, and as might have been expected, were defeated, but they succeeded in stopping him for the day on which the battle took place. The next morning Early started on his march to the capital of the nation, arriving before it on the 11th. Learning of the gravity of the situation, I had directed General Meade to also order Wright with the rest of his corps directly to Washington for the relief of that place, and the latter reached there the very day that Early arrived before it. The 10th Corps, which had been stationed in Louisiana, having been ordered up to reinforce the armies about Richmond, had about this time arrived at Fortress Monroe, on their way to join us. I diverted them from that point to Washington, which place they reached, almost simultaneously with Wright on the 11th. The 19th Corps was commanded by Major General Emory. Early made his reconnaissance with a view of attacking on the following morning, the 12th, but the next morning he found our entrenchments, which were very strong, fully manned. He at once commenced to retreat, Wright following. There is no telling how much this result was contributed to by General Lew Wallace's leading what might well be considered almost a forlorn hope. If Early had been but one day earlier, he might have entered the capital before the arrival of the reinforcements I had sent. Whether the delay caused by the battle amounted to a day or not, General Wallace contributed on this occasion, by the defeat of the troops under him, a greater benefit to the cause than often falls to the lot of a commander of an equal force to render by means of a victory. Farther west also, the troubles were threatening. Some time before, Forrest had met Sturgis in command of some of our cavalry in Mississippi and handled him very roughly, gaining a very great victory over him. This left Forrest free to go almost where he pleased, and to cut the roads in rear of Sherman, who was then advancing. Sherman was abundantly able to look after the army that he was immediately with, and all of his military division so long as he could communicate with it, but it was my place to see that he had the means with which to hold his rear. 2 divisions under A.J. Smith had been sent to Banks in Louisiana some months before. Sherman ordered these back with directions to attack Forrest. Smith met and defeated him very badly. I then directed that Smith should hang to Forrest and not let him go, and to prevent by all means his getting upon the Memphis and Nashville Railroad. Sherman had anticipated me in this matter, and given the same orders in substance, but receiving my directions for this order to Smith, he repeated it. On the 25th of June, General Burnside had commenced running a mine from about the centre of his front under the Confederate works confronting him. He was induced to do this by Colonel Pleasants of the Pennsylvania Volunteers, whose regiment was mostly composed of miners, and who was himself a practical miner. Burnside had submitted the scheme to Meade and myself, and we both approved of it as a means of keeping the men occupied. His position was very favourable for carrying on this work, but not so favourable for the operations to follow its completion. The position of the 2 lines at that point were only about 100 yards apart, with a comparatively deep ravine intervening. In the bottom of this ravine, the work commenced. The position was unfavourable in this particular, that the enemy's line at that point was re-entering, so that its front was commanded by their own lines both to the right and left. Then, too, the ground was sloping upward back of the Confederate line for a considerable distance, and it was presumable that the enemy had, at least, a detached work on this highest point. The work progressed, and on the 23rd of July the mine was finished ready for charging. But I had this work of charging deferred until we were ready for it. On the 17th of July several deserters came in and said that there was great consternation in Richmond, and that Lee was coming out to make an attack upon us, the object being to put us on the defensive so that he might detach troops to go to Georgia, where the army Sherman was operating against was said to be in great trouble. I put the army commanders, Meade and Butler, on the lookout, but the attack was not made. Concluded then, a few days later, to do something in the way of an offensive movement myself, having in view something of the same object that Lee had had. Wright's and Emory's corps were in Washington, and with this reduction of my force, Lee might very readily have spared some troops from the defences to send west. I had other objects in view, however, besides keeping Lee where he was. The mine was constructed and ready to be exploded, and I wanted to take that occasion to carry Petersburg if I could. It was the object, therefore, to get as many of Lee's troops away from the south side of the James River as possible. Accordingly, on the 26th, we commenced a movement with Hancock's corps and Sheridan's cavalry to the north side by way of Deep Bottom, where Butler had a pontoon bridge laid. The plan, in the main, was to let the cavalry cut loose, and, joining with Coutz's cavalry of the Army of the James, get by Lee's lines and destroy as much as they could of the Virginia Central Railroad, while in the meantime the infantry was to move out so as to protect their rear and cover their retreat back when they should have got through with their work. We were successful in drawing the enemy's troops to the north side of the James, as I expected. The mine was ordered to be charged, and the morning of the 30th of July was the time fixed for its explosion. I gave Meade minute orders on the 24th, directing how I wanted the assault conducted, which orders he amplified into general instructions for the guidance of the troops that were to be engaged. Meade's instructions, which I, of course, approved most heartily, were all that I can see now was necessary. The only further precaution which he could have taken, and which he could not foresee, would have been to have different men to execute them. The gallery to the mine was over 500 feet long from where it entered the ground to the point where it was under the enemy's works, and with a cross-gallery of something over 80 feet running under their lines. 8 chambers had been left, requiring a ton of powder each to charge them. All was ready by the time I had prescribed, and on the 29th Hancock and Sheridan were brought back near the James River with their troops. Under cover of night they started to recross the bridge at Deep Bottom, and to march directly for that part of our lines in front of the mine. Warren was to hold his line of entrenchments with a sufficient number of men and concentrate the balance on the right next to Burnside's corps, while Ord, now commanding the 18th Corps, temporarily under Meade, was to form in the rear of Burnside to support him when he went in. All were to clear off the parapets and the abatis in their front so as to leave the space as open as possible and be able to charge the moment the mine had been sprung and Burnside had taken possession. Burnside's corps was not to stop in the crater at all, but push on to the top of the hill, supported on the right and left by Ord's and Warren's corps. Warren and Ord fulfilled their instructions perfectly so far as making ready was concerned. Burnside seemed to have paid no attention whatever to the instructions, and left all the obstruction in his own front for his troops to get over in the best way they could. The 4 divisions of his corps were commanded by Generals Potter, Wilcox, Ledlie and Ferrero. The last was a coloured division, and Burnside selected it to make the assault. Meade interfered with this. Burnside then took Ledlie's division, a worse selection than the first could have been. In fact, Potter and Wilcox were the only division commanders Burnside had who were equal to the occasion. Ledlie, besides being otherwise inefficient, proved also to possess disqualifications less common among soldiers. There was some delay about the explosion of the mine, so that it did not go off until about 5 o'clock in the morning. When it did explode, it was very successful, making a crater 20 feet deep and something like 100 feet in length. Instantly 110 cannon and 50 mortars, which had been placed in the most commanding positions covering the ground to the right and left of where the troops were to enter the enemy's lines, commenced playing. Ledlie's division marched into the crater immediately on the explosion, but most of the men stopped there in the absence of anyone to give directions, their commander having found some safe retreat to get into before they started. There was some delay on the left and right in advancing, but some of the troops did get in and turn to the right and left, carrying the rifle pits as I expected they would do. There had been great consternation in Petersburg, as we were well aware, about a rumoured mine that we were going to explode. They knew we were mining, and they had failed to cut our mine off by countermining, though Beauregard had taken the precaution to run up a line of entrenchments to the rear of that part of their line fronting where they could see that our men were at work. We had learned through deserters who had come in that the people had very wild rumours about what was going on our side. They said that we had undermined the whole of Petersburg, that they were resting upon a slumbering volcano and did not know at what moment they might expect an eruption. I somewhat based my calculations upon this state of feeling, and expected that when the mine was exploded, the troops to the right and left would flee in all directions, and that our troops, if they moved promptly, could get in and strengthen themselves before the enemy had come to a realization of the true situation. It was just as I expected it would be. We could see the men running without any apparent object except to get away. It was half an hour before musketry firing, to amount to anything, was opened upon our men in the crater. It was an hour before the enemy got artillery up to play upon them, and it was 9 o'clock before Lee got up reinforcements from his right to join in expelling our troops. The effort was a stupendous failure. It cost us about 4,000 men, mostly, however, captured, and all due to inefficiency on the part of the corps commander and the incompetency of the division commander who was sent to lead the assault. After being fully assured of the failure of the mine, and finding that most of that part of Lee's army which had been drawn north of the James River were still there, I gave Meade directions to send a corps of infantry and the cavalry next morning, before Lee could get his forces back, to destroy 15 or 20 miles of the Weldon Railroad. But misfortunes never come singly. I learned during that same afternoon that Wright's pursuit of Early was feeble because of the constant and contrary orders he had been receiving from Washington, while I was cut off from immediate communication by reason of our cable across Chesapeake Bay being broken. Early, however, was not aware of the fact that Wright was not pursuing until he had reached Strasburg. Finding that he was not pursued, he turned back to Winchester, where Crook was stationed with a small force, and drove him out. He then pushed north until he had reached The Potomac, then he sent McCausland across to Chambersburg, Pa, to destroy that town. Chambersburg was a purely defenceless town with no garrison whatever and no fortifications, yet McCausland, under Early's orders, burned the place and left about 300 families houseless. This occurred on the 30th of July. I rescinded my orders for the troops to go out to destroy the Weldon Railroad and directed them to embark for Washington City. After burning Chambersburg, McCausland retreated, pursued by our cavalry, towards Cumberland. They were met and defeated by General Kelly and driven into Virginia. The Shenandoah Valley was very important to the Confederates because it was the principal storehouse they now had for feeding their armies about Richmond. It was well known that they would make a desperate struggle to maintain it. It had been the source of a great deal of trouble to us heretofore to guard that outlet to the north, partly because of the incompetency of some of the commanders, but chiefly because of interference from Washington. It seemed to be the policy of General Halleck and Secretary Stanton to keep any force sent there in pursuit of the invading army moving right and left so as to keep between the enemy and our capital, and generally speaking, they pursued this policy until all knowledge of the whereabouts of the enemy was lost. They were left, therefore, free to supply themselves with horses, beef cattle, and such provisions as they could carry away from western Maryland and Pennsylvania. I determined to put a stop to this. I started Sheridan at once for that field of operation, and on the following day sent another division of his cavalry. I had previously asked to have Sheridan assigned to that command, but Mr. Stanton objected on the ground that he was too young for so important a command. On the 1st of August, when I sent reinforcements for the protection of Washington, I sent the following orders. City Point, VA, August 1st, 1864, 11:30 a.m. Major General Halleck, Washington, D.C. I am sending General Sheridan for temporary duty whilst the enemy is being expelled from the border. Unless General Hunter is in the field in person, I want Sheridan put in command of all the troops in the field, with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death. Wherever the enemy goes, let our troops go also. Once started up the valley, they ought to be followed until we get possession of the Virginia Central Railroad. If General Hunter is in the field, give Sheridan direct command of the 6th Corps and Cavalry Division. All the cavalry, I presume, will reach Washington in the course of tomorrow. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. The President, in some way or other, got to see this dispatch of mine directing certain instructions to be given to the commanders in the field, operating against Early, and sent me the following very characteristic dispatch. Office U.S. Military Telegraph, Walk Department, Washington, D.C., August 3rd, 1864. Cipher, 6 p.m., Lee General Grant, City Point, VAR. I have seen your dispatch in which you say, I want Sheridan put in command of all the troops in the field, with instructions to put himself south of the enemy and follow him to the death. Wherever the enemy goes, let our troops go also. This, I think, is exactly right as to how our forces should move. But please look over the dispatches you may have received from here, even since you made that order, and discover, if you can, that there is any idea in the head of anyone here of putting our army south of the enemy, or of following him to the death in any direction. I repeat to you, it will neither be done nor attempted unless you watch it every day, and hour, and force it. I replied to this that one would start in 2 hours for Washington, and soon got off, going directly to the Monocacy without stopping at Washington on my way. I found General Hunter's army encamped there, scattered over the fields along the banks of the Monocacy, with many hundreds of cars and locomotives belonging to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which he had taken the precaution to bring back and collect at that point. I asked the general where the enemy was. He replied that he did not know. He said the fact was that he was so embarrassed with orders from Washington moving him first to the right and then to the left that he had lost all trace of the enemy. I then told the general that I would find out where the enemy was, and at once ordered steam got up and trains made up, giving directions to push for Halltown, some 4 miles above Harper's Ferry, in the Shenandoah Valley. The cavalry and the wagon trains were to march, but all the troops that could be transported by the cars were to go in that way. I knew that the valley was of such importance to the enemy that no matter how much he was scattered at that time, he would in a very short time be found in front of our troops moving south. I then wrote out General Hunter's instructions. I told him that Sheridan was in Washington, and still another division was on its way, and suggested that he establish the headquarters of the department at any point that would suit him best, Cumberland, Baltimore, or elsewhere, and give Sheridan command of the troops in the field. The general replied to this, that he thought he had better be relieved entirely. He said that General Halleck seemed so much to distrust his fitness for the position he was in that he thought somebody else ought to be there. He did not want in any way to embarrass the cause, thus showing a patriotism that was none too common in the army. There were not many major generals who would voluntarily have asked to have the command of a department taken from them on the supposition that for some particular reason, or for any reason, the service would be better performed. I told him, "Very well then," and telegraphed at once for Sheridan to come to the Monocacy, and suggested that I would wait and meet him there. Sheridan came at once by special train, but reached there after the troops were all off. I went to the station and remained there until he arrived. Myself and one or two of my staff were about all the Union people, except General Hunter and his staff, who were left at the Monocacy when Sheridan arrived. I hastily told Sheridan what had been done and what I wanted him to do, giving him at the same time the written instructions which had been prepared for General Hunter and directed to that officer. Sheridan now had about 30,000 men to move with, 8,000 of them being cavalry. Early had about the same number, but the superior ability of the national commander over the Confederate commander was so great that all the latter's advantage of being on the defensive was more than counterbalanced by this circumstance. As I had predicted, Early was soon found in front of Sheridan in the valley, and Pennsylvania and Maryland were speedily freed from the invaders. The importance of the valley was so great to the Confederates that Lee reinforced Early, but not to the extent that we thought and feared he would. To prevent as much as possible these reinforcements from being sent out from Richmond, I had to do something to compel Lee to retain his forces about his capital. I therefore gave orders for another move to the north side of the James River to threaten Richmond. Hancock's corps, part of the 10th Corps under Birney, and Gregg's division of cavalry were crossed to the north side of the James during the night of the 19th of August. A threatening position was maintained for a number of days, with more or less skirmishing, and some tolerably hard fighting. Although it was my object and my instructions that anything like a battle should be avoided, unless opportunities should present themselves which would ensure great success. General Meade was left in command of the few troops around Petersburg, strongly entrenched, and was instructed to keep a close watch upon the enemy in that quarter, and himself to take advantage of any weakening that might occur through an effort on the part of the enemy to reinforce the north side. There was no particular victory gained on either side, but during that time no more reinforcements were sent to the valley. I informed Sheridan of what had been done to prevent reinforcements being sent from Richmond against him, and also that the efforts we had made had proven that one of the divisions which we supposed had gone to the valley was still at Richmond, because we had captured 600 or 700 prisoners from that division, each of its 4 brigades having contributed to our list of captures. I also informed him that but one division had gone, and it was possible that I should be able to prevent the going of any more. To add to my embarrassment at this time, Sherman, who was now near Atlanta, wanted reinforcements. He was perfectly willing to take the raw troops then being raised in the northwest, saying that he could teach them more soldiering in one day among his troops than they would learn in a week in a camp of instruction. I therefore asked that all troops in camps of instruction in the northwest be sent to him. Sherman also wanted to be assured that no eastern troops were moving out against him. I informed him of what I had done and assured him that I would hold all the troops there that it was possible for me to hold, and that up to that time none had gone. I also informed him that his real danger was from Kirby Smith, who commanded the Trans-Mississippi Department. If Smith should escape Steele and get across the Mississippi River, he might move against him. I had, therefore, asked to have an expedition ready to move from New Orleans against Mobile, in case Kirby Smith should get across. This would have a tendency to draw him to the defence of that place, instead of going against Sherman. Right in the midst of all these embarrassments, Halleck informed me that there was an organised scheme on foot in the north to resist the draft, and suggested that it might become necessary to draw troops from the field to put it down. He also advised taking in sail and not going too fast. The troops were withdrawn from the north side of the James River on the night of the 20th. Before they were withdrawn, however, and while most of Lee's force was on that side of the river, Warren had been sent with most of the 5th Corps to capture the Weldon Railroad. He took up his line of march well back to the rear, south of the enemy, while the troops remaining in the trenches extended so as to cover that part of the line which he had vacated by moving out. From our left, near the old line, it was about 3 miles to the Weldon Railroad. A division was ordered from the right of the Petersburg line to reinforce Warren, while a division was brought back from the north side of the James River to take its place. This road was very important to the enemy. The limits from which his supplies had been drawn were already very much contracted, and I knew that he must fight desperately to protect it. Warren carried the road, though with heavy loss on both sides. He fortified his new position, and our trenches were then extended from the left of our main line to connect with his new one. Lee made repeated attempts to dislodge Warren's corps, but without success, and with heavy loss. As soon as Warren was fortified and reinforcements reached him, troops were sent south to destroy the bridges on the Weldon Railroad, and with such success that the enemy had to draw in wagons, for a distance of about 30 miles, all the supplies they got thereafter from that source. It was on the 21st that Lee seemed to have given up the Weldon Railroad as having been lost to him, but along about the 24th. Or 25th he made renewed attempts to recapture it. Again he failed, and with very heavy losses to him as compared with ours. On the night of the 20th, our troops on the north side of the James were withdrawn, and Hancock and Gregg were sent south to destroy the Weldon Railroad. They were attacked on the 25th at Reams's station, and after desperate fighting a part of our line gave way, losing 5 pieces of artillery. But the Weldon Railroad never went out of our possession from the 18th of August to the close of the war. Chapter 58. Sheridan's Advance, Visit to Sheridan, Sheridan's Victory in the Shenandoah, Sheridan's Ride to Winchester, Close of the Campaign for the Winter. We had our troops on the Weldon Railroad contending against a large force that regarded this road of so much importance that they could afford to expend many lives in retaking it. Sherman just getting through to Atlanta with great losses of men from casualties, discharges and detachments left along as guards to occupy and hold the road in rear of him. Washington threatened but a short time before, and now Early being strengthened in the valley so as, probably, to renew that attempt. It kept me pretty active in looking after all these points. On the 10th of August, Sheridan had advanced on Early up the Shenandoah Valley, Early falling back to Strasburg. On the 12th, I learned that Lee had sent 20 pieces of artillery, 2 divisions of infantry, and a considerable cavalry force to strengthen Early. It was important that Sheridan should be informed of this, so I sent the information to Washington by telegraph, and directed a courier to be sent from there to get the message to Sheridan at all hazards, giving him the information. The messenger, an officer of the army, pushed through with great energy, and reached Sheridan just in time. The officer went through by way of Snicker's Gap, escorted by some cavalry. He found Sheridan just making his preparations to attack Early in his chosen position. Now, however, he was thrown back on the defensive. On the 15th of September, I started to visit General Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley. My purpose was to have him attack Early, or drive him out of the valley and destroy that source of supplies for Lee's army. I knew it was impossible for me to get orders through Washington to Sheridan to make a move, because they would be stopped there, and such orders as Halleck's caution, and that of the Secretary of War, would suggest would be given instead, and would, no doubt, be contradictory to mine. I, therefore, without stopping at Washington, went directly through to Charlestown, some 10 miles above Harper's Ferry, and waited there to see General Sheridan, having sent a courier in advance to inform him where to meet me. When Sheridan arrived, I asked him if he had a map showing the positions of his army and that of the enemy. He at once drew one out of his side pocket, showing all roads and streams and the camps of the two armies. He said that if he had permission, he would move so-and-so, pointing out how, against the Confederates, and that he could whip them. Before starting, I had drawn up a plan of campaign for Sheridan, which I had brought with me. But seeing that he was so clear and so positive in his views and so confident of success, I said nothing about this and did not take it out of my pocket. Sheridan's wagon trains were kept at Harper's Ferry, where all of his stores were. By keeping the teams at that place, their forage did not have to be hauled to them. As supplies of ammunition, provisions, and rations for the men were wanted, trains would be made up to deliver the stores to the commissaries and quartermasters encamped at Winchester. Knowing that he, in making preparations to move at a given day, would have to bring up wagon trains from Harper's Ferry, I asked him if he could be ready to get off by the following Tuesday. This was on Friday. "Oh yes," he said. He could be off before daylight on Monday. I told him then to make the attack at that time and according to his plan, and I immediately started to return to the army about Richmond. After visiting Baltimore and Burlington, New Jersey, I arrived at City Point on the 10th.